We'll go ahead and bring the House Welfare Reform Committee meeting to order this Thursday, March 14th. Sorry, Thursday, March 7th. That's what happens when you read the agenda. So today, the purpose of the meeting is to just have a committee discussion on the topic of homelessness, different I think we got a point of order from Representative Johnson. Ouch. Okay, so the purpose of the meeting, we've sat through a lot of presentations last year, this year on the topic of homelessness. We've listened to a lot of cities come in and tell us what they're doing, some national level guests, had the bill hearing. And sometimes, you know, throughout my 8 years here, it just seems like there's a lot of there's a lack of opportunity to talk freely about a topic. And when we do discuss, it's generally in a hearing setting where there's not a whole lot of time available, or it's working a bill, which there's a lot going on, specifically on a bill and amendments. But there's rarely time in the committee process to just have more of a roundtable discussion. And I'd like to give it a shot. So just kind of go over, you know, what's the goal today? Just to have the discussion about the topic of homelessness with an opportunity to talk a little bit more openly and more directly, ask questions even of other committee members. You know, how should this work? What do you think of that? Of course, you know, want to hear people out, so limit the interruptions. Always be respectful. There's different opinions. I guarantee you my opinion on this is different than others. But also try to limit your soapbox opportunities, your statements to about 2 minutes. We've got plenty of time. I'm sure we'll have plenty of shots at it. And then also try to speak more about what you believe, what you think, and questions you have. Please refrain from projecting onto others your thoughts on their opinions. And feel free to ask questions of other members, just on why they think the way they do, what do they see as far as the situation. So just very open and free conversation. Before we get into that though, I believe Representative Pickert, you have some introductions to make.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. We have about probably half of the class of the government class that was in the gallery and with me in the House chamber today. They're from Southeast High School. Their teacher over there is Tanya Howard, and I see Andrew Lee, who's serving as an intern up here. He graduated from Southeast last year, so he's with the group. But yeah, so thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Sandy. So welcome to committee. Hopefully we'll put on a good performance for you. So I'll just run through, I jotted down some questions, just, I'm sure you all have lists, but just something, and I don't, just to stimulate ideas, discussion, and we'll just open it up, but just kind of, we talked a lot about local ordinances on camping and vagrancy. Just a question that might come up is, what should those be, if any? And then we've talked a lot about the role of the local communities, and then the role of the state. Should there be a distinction? Should both be involved? I think that's going to be certainly a decent amount of the conversation, hopefully. And then we've talked about enforcement at the local level. Is that a major component? Is it not? Another question that I've had is, can money and effort be effective without some form of consequences, enforcement at the local level. And I guess for me, I like to be effective with the efforts I put forth. And that is a concern that I have with a lot of legislation that gets proposed, is will it actually achieve its end? So it's definitely part of the way I look at this issue. So with that, happy to open up the discussion. Would anybody like to start? Representative Drew.
Thank you, Chairman. I think one of the first questions I have, when we talk homelessness, we hear all the different ways to handle it. How do we sort through to know which the best way is? Now, I know that's not the base we're talking about, you know, housing the homeless at this time, but how's the best way? We've heard about San Francisco and New Jersey and San Antonio, and I'm curious if anybody has any, you know, everybody seems to think that they know what they're doing. Does anybody in here have a good idea of what is working, or is it just people trying to convince themselves they're getting somewhere?
Representative Carr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And with respect to the representative's question, you know, I think where it sounds to me like we go somewhat awry is that we take the approach that there's a peanut butter spread that's going to work for every community in every city, and that just doesn't, to me, sound like it would work. With respect to my colleague, Representative Roth, and the statement that he made, or the question that he posed several days ago, and, you know, I had to side with him on that question, because the plan that I'd been hearing about and that it seemed like we were working towards, you know, to his credit, it wasn't going to serve his people, at least not in the same fashion that it would serve the people in a much larger demographic area like Wichita. So I think that, you know, when we start having these conversations, we need to let those individuals who are effectively the subject matter experts for their particular communities be the ones that weigh in, and we not, you know, force a peanut butter spread program out for everyone.
In response to your question, so how do we sort through and know what's the best way? It seems like a lot of the discussions that or the presentations we've heard, they all say about the same thing. It's a complex issue. It seems to continually change. And if I were to throw in my opinion on the answer to that, it may not be a peanut butter spread, one size fits all program, but is the answer that the local community is the best way to solve the problem? So that local community taking it on their shoulders to say, hey, what do we have to do on a local level to solve this problem? During the interim committee last November, the first presenter was a business owner from downtown Topeka, and they had a lot of issues with the homeless on Kansas Avenue, I think, and also in the alleys behind, a lot of trash, and a lot of other things going on that they ended up just taking it on their shoulders. He said that he sent out his employees to clean up the alleys. He said he contacted the local police, and they started to form a group to address the issue. You know, so I don't know if there's a peanut butter spread that works for everybody, but as far as a starting point, that would be my answer to your question. The one thing that I would say is the best way is to start at the local level. Representative Hoagland.
Well, I've worked with homeless people for a very long time at the local level. And the issue becomes the funding. Because, for instance, we have a shelter that's held in a church. The church did not have showers. So in order to house the homeless in this facility, we spent $150,000 putting in showers in a church that we don't own. Now, the church is going to have those showers forever, but we only have like a 5-year, I believe, commitment from that church to be there. So that's a lot of money. And I kind of feel like homeless it's not as big as education, but in the aspect of education, the legislature can fund it and then oversee it and have the localities take care of it. But it's going to take some state funding, I believe, to help with these people. That was a lot of money for a couple of showers.
Representative Meyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, as you all are very aware, I'm pretty opinionated on this topic. But that comes from a very particular place. And, you know, I definitely have continue to try to see all sides of this issue. I know that we've all got various opinions, and I think that we've got to be careful how we address each other when we're talking about sensitive issues like this and like so many others that we deal with out here. The thing that I continue to find concern with, though, is that we tend to rely on stereotypes rather than data and evidence and our own personal biases or thoughts on the matter versus subject matter experts from various backgrounds. You know, as you all know, I'm a social worker. I've been doing that for decades. But, you know, personally, my life has been touched by homelessness, and I've known quite a few people who have been affected as well. And it's not a moral failing. And it's not because they're substance abusers or just don't want to work. As you mentioned, Mr. Chair, this is such a complex issue, and there are so many studies on it everywhere. And I think that the thing that I would like to see us focus on in our personal thoughts as we pursue direction with this is really looking at evidence-based practices and considering all the different ways that different communities have tried to address this and search for ones that work the best. And, you know, that can be hard because we all come to the table with our own thoughts and our own opinions about everything, right? And that's why we're here. Everyone deserves a voice. But, you know, my job here is to be a voice for the voiceless. And I've spent my life trying to do that. And this is an extension of that. And that's why I'm so very passionate about it and can get a little spicy from time to time. But I really do think that if we focus on looking at evidence-based practices as a base and listening to homeless service providers, social workers, substance abuse professionals, you know, the state, KDADS, DCF, KDHE, and really look at this more from that perspective, that we'll have a lot more luck with not only convincing other people how important this issue is, but also finding a way to work together. Because I think we can all agree that this is something we all want to try to solve. But I think that the issue is that it's so complicated, and we come with our own personal thoughts and opinions on it. But these are still people, and I deeply care about them. And, you know, I worry that we're going to continue to criminalize poverty and consider it as a moral failing when it's really a failing of society in a lot of ways. So that's what I would like to see.
Representative Howell?
Thank you, Chair. I'll just say on a personal note that as I have learned and worked hard to educate myself on this topic over the last year, the things that rose to the surface on the different homeless programs and facilities across the United States that I observed that I view to be very successful had four things in common. And the four things in common were a collaboration amongst the elected officials, community leaders, and the nonprofits that were working hard to serve the homeless and help the homeless. The second was data collection and sharing of that information amongst the appropriate people in order to better understand what the homeless, what's just basic information about the homeless, what their needs were, what, if there's substance abuse issues or mental health issues or, just basic information, where they're from, those types of things. The third was what is commonly referred to peer help, and that is either employees or volunteers in those programs that have been homeless themselves and have been successful in getting out of no longer being homeless and being able to become independent. And the fourth is having the wraparound services. And when the chair is appropriate, thinks that is appropriate, I would love to have some discussion based off of testimony that we heard yesterday and questions from this committee. Was it yesterday, day before, whatever that was. I would love to have a discussion on thoughts of what we think wraparound services should be, what they are, and what we think is reasonable if we're going to define wraparound services for people to apply for the grant for homeless shelter infrastructure, and what is reasonable for both urban and rural counties and areas. So I'll leave that part of, I won't say more unless the chair feels like it's time to enter into that discussion, but that's an area that I would like to go into.
Sure, I think we've got plenty of time, but Representative Johnson, were you wanting to? Yep, Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to look out there in the audience. Oh, I used to be a government teacher till I came up here. Who wants to make $5 and come up to the podium right now? This gentleman right here. There you go. Okay. Turn on the microphone, give us your name, and I'm curious what grade level.
My name is Eden Williams Parker. I'm a 12th grader or a senior.
Very good. So you're looking around at these people here at this table. We're all got suits or nice clothes on.
Yes.
Do you think we have any clue what the homeless really want? You come from Wichita. I'm assuming you have some folks down there. I grew up in Wyandotte County. Tell us, what do you think about this kind of a group? Do you think we can actually help? I'd like to know.
So homelessness in Wichita is a very big issue right now, and I have met many people who have struggled with homelessness. And looking in this room, I feel as if homelessness is such a complex topic that I don't feel like one individual can truly understand it unless they live through it. And I'm imagining that many of you have not lived through such a struggle. And no disrespect to any of you, it's just, it's something you have to go through to understand it. And while I hope that you guys can truly understand the struggles of homeless people, which you are clearly trying to do, it's just such a topic that you need to be in the shoes of the person to see through them.
That is the best answer. You ought to be a politician, young man. I'm serious.
I like
Extra
money.
credit, extra credit. Thank you.
So on that note, On that note, looks like we need to just adjourn and go live the life. Did you have anything, any follow-up? Any further questions, comments? Representative Humphries.
So how do we define wraparound services?
Any thoughts on that? Representative Meyer.
I have lots of thoughts on that. Thank you for asking that question. And also, I just want to thank you for your bravery. That was amazing. Aha, yeah. That's about how much we make every day, too. So, so as far as wraparound services, the programs that I've seen be the most successful offered a wide variety of services. And, I'd also like to take this opportunity to kind of begin at the start of kind of where I think there's some confusion related to some of the terminology we use when we're talking about addressing homelessness. So I'll get to it. So housing first, I know that we've talked a lot about this and a lot of folks don't like that terminology and I get it. It sounds like, oh, we're just going to give someone a house and then walk away and, never mind. But that's not really how it works on the ground. Housing first is just saying it's like triaging someone in an ER, basically. We need to make sure that they have their immediate needs met, that they're going to be safe and secure. They're going to be away from the elements, away from the danger that they're facing on the streets, and get them into some place that will really give them the opportunity to access the wraparound services, which are offered on a continuous basis through these programs. So the wraparound services that are typically offered are things like substance use disorder treatment, case management services, which encompasses, oh my gosh, so many different things. As a former case manager, I can tell you there was no limit to what I did to serve my clients. So that would include things like helping them access job training, education, SNAP benefits if they're eligible for it, child care assistance if they're eligible for it, child care, medical assistance, Medicaid if they're eligible. If the individual is disabled and you have a SOAR trained case managers, they would go through the SOAR application process, which we heard about recently. So helping them apply for disability, just any benefits that they may be eligible for to help them transition from being on the streets and being street homeless or couch surfing or whatever into a life of stability. And the thing with that is that, congregate shelters, that's a very temporary solution. And I think what would best address the situation with the wraparound services is making sure that we get someone triaged, we get them safe and stable, and then we offer those services like I just mentioned, and there's so many more. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Nearly any social service you can think of is offered in that setting. And so we're talking about more of a transitional housing thing. So the emergency shelter is one way we address the immediate need. And then when there is funding and beds available, folks are moved to more of a housing first, transitional housing, permanent supportive housing thing based on their specific needs. And then all of those services are immediately made available to them. So that's kind of the idea with wraparound services, because anyone who works in the homeless services sphere understands that you can't just say, here's a place to go and then walk away, because that doesn't actually help the situation. So, and I don't know that that's always necessarily conveyed very well in this setting, but those of us on the ground who do the work, that's what we do in real life every day. And so that's really what I think that means. Wraparound services, just anything you think of.
Good. So I mean, we're in so much agreement with all of that. But when I hear you compare Housing First to triage in an emergency room, maybe I've misunderstood that, to me, that sounds like an emergency room is temporary. You don't stay there. You eventually get put somewhere else. So when I hear Housing First, I think of, maybe you're getting wraparound services, but you are given more of a permanent place. I think of Housing First as a, more or less permanent place instead of a shelter or, temporary. So tell me definitions, what you think of as, what I just said, yeah.
No, absolutely. Thank you for asking that question. So, I tried to do the best I could with my analogy. I don't know, maybe it wasn't that great, but so when we're talking about that, it's not actually permanent housing unless they're put into permanent supportive housing, and that's usually for people with severe disabilities or severe mental illnesses who can't care for themselves, as we heard from KDADS the other day. A Housing First is more like we say, okay, they're in a shelter situation right now, and that, of course, is not permanent. Most shelters are limited. You have to be there you're only allowed to be there certain times of the day. They make you leave and come back and sign in, and it's just a process over and over again, and there aren't always beds. So what Housing First does is it actually takes the individual and puts them into more of a transitional housing model. So they aren't always reliant on the system or any of the funding that would go into it. It's typically limited to a 30 to 90 day stay, sometimes up to 120, depending on the situation and age of the person. And during that time period is when they access the wraparound services and are stabilized. Now, if they don't exit the program successfully, which does happen sometimes, there's usually a waiting period before the individual is allowed back in. But there's also an incredible waiting list for these programs as well. So it's not like someone just walks in off the street and says, I want a place to live and I'm not going to do anything for it. Give it to me. It's a really long process, and there's a lot of assessments that go into it, and it's a very temporary thing. So it's intended to be temporary too, just to stabilize people so that they can get back to being,
Yeah, I mean, and that sounds great, but I do have one last question, I think. It's just, so when we hear about the pallet homes in Lawrence, tell me, that seems not transitional, and it doesn't, for sure, it's not a shelter. So what is, and I've not visited that neighborhood, but we could take a field trip sometime, Chairman. But, yeah, so tell me what that is.
I am not as familiar with that program. I'm not familiar enough with it to speak on that. I don't believe that the intention is just to house people there permanently, but that would be a better question for the Lawrence County City Commissioners and everything. So I'm sorry, I don't want to misrepresent their purpose. Yeah.
Representative Howell.
Sorry, I will try not to talk overly much during this discussion, but I have a lot of words, as you all know. Okay, so I just wanted to say two things. As I recall, when Lawrence, they remember they have a new, when they presented to us for this session, they had a brand new, like 1 month housing director. And as I recall, when she presented about the pallet houses, she talked about them being there for just a very, a relatively short period of time. So they considered them transitional houses. But they were some of the more challenging placements that they would be working with. And so she thought it might take up to a year to get them moved out of the pallet houses and into the correct place. And then just on a personal note, I just wanted to share, I have a large family, so I will just say, I think I can get away with this. So I've had a loved one that has dealt with being homeless for many years. And it took us a long time as family members to try to figure out how best to help this loved one and to really kind of recognize what we were dealing with. And so when we finally started realizing that there were some significant mental health issues and behaviors that went along with that, we helped this loved one to work on and sign up for Section 8 housing and to qualify for a mental health disability. That process took basically 2 years to go through. And in the meantime, because of this loved one's behavioral situations, they really could not be successful working and be stable. So they ended up going to a homeless shelter after many extended things that I will not go into, of them being homeless or bouncing around on couches and things like that with strangers, things of that nature. And when they went to the homeless shelter, they were eventually moved into what would be classified as transitional housing that they were authorized for because they were in process of waiting to qualify for mental health disability. And they lived with assistance in temporary transitional housing for probably close to a year before they were able to go through the entire process of qualifying for their mental health disability. So that would be kind of a real world example of at least one type of a situation that where the transitional housing would be or could be applied in a real world.
Representative Droege?
Homelessness, from what all we've learned, it seems it's a very long-term thing. It has to do with drugs, alcohol, mental illness, and there's even people that choose to be homeless. So we talk about some of the, like the wraparound services, they seem endless almost. And I just wanted to mention that we're elected to be up here to be stewards of the money of the taxpayer. And so I think we also, we can't just, it's just not endless money. I think of it like running a family. You only have a certain amount of money to go around. And so I wanted to mention that because as you talk about, I thought of it as wraparound services because they are so expansive. It depends on which case that you're looking at, what they need, and how long are they going to need these wraparound services. And we're kind of talking about some temporary care, and we all think, nobody wants somebody to be out there and freeze to death or die in the heat. But we're talking at just the tip of the iceberg, and sometimes I'm not sure that just piling money on it does any good. I know that there's money involved, but you don't just say, oh man, things are terrible, give us a bunch of money. There's got to be a real plan to deal with it.
Representative Meyer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I totally get what you're trying to say here. I would like to reiterate, though, and clarify some information about what you mentioned about substance abusers and folks like that. The data shows that only 13% of individuals who are street homeless are actively in the throes of substance abuse and addiction. And we've seen a lot of testimony on that as well. I know one person came in and said something like 80%, but when we went back and looked at the actual data involved, it was only 13. And so I just want to make sure we're mindful of that. But I do understand your concern about how this could just be endless, right? The problem is that it kind of is endless. New people experience different things every day. As we know, there are a lot of issues affecting all of us financially, and many people are just one paycheck away from losing their place. Then we get into talking about, well, maybe, and once again, back to how I don't believe that it's a true moral failing. It's more of a failing of society, because we're looking at this from a perspective, at least from my perspective, where we've got some real serious issues going on with the economy and housing prices and everything like that. So when you've got a lot of folks who are one paycheck away from losing their place, then they get evicted, well, then they've got an eviction on their record and they can't get another place. So then what do? You've got people who are facing issues with their credit due to a myriad of issues related, to economic inequality. And, then what do we do? And so, where I can understand what you're saying, I do also want to emphasize that there are the majority, I mean, all of the nonprofits at this point are the ones who are really taking on the share of this. And I think to the bill that we just discussed, this is just a drop in the bucket and an opportunity for different municipalities to take advantage of some funding to get them started, or to at least provide some infrastructure so that they can continue to offer services. Now, will the wraparound services ever end? Probably not, and I don't believe they should, because like I said, you never know, it's not one person all the time coming in. It's many different people from many different backgrounds, and, I would hate to not have those services available to me or a family member that I love if they face that tragedy, because we just said, no, that's it, we're done. So it's a long-term issue, and I think that everyone in the United States is addressing it. So sure, we should look at that, but I think we have to keep some of those things in mind too.
Representative Carr?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would like to address one issue because everyone says that, they make the statement that, and some people just want to be homeless. And I'm not saying that there may not be an individual out there who really, just wants to, live off the lay of the land. But, that's an incorrect statement. They don't want to be homeless. What they don't want is to be in a situation where they feel like they're being confined and they have to abide by a certain set of rules that are put upon them by someone else. And then someone says, well, you've always got to live by rules. Fortunately, I'm not in a place where I am homeless, but if that were to happen to me tomorrow, I am probably not the candidate that would go to a shelter, right? I personally have too much pride to go to that shelter. I would make do, and if that meant that I would have to be outside, living under a tree, my pride just wouldn't allow me to go into a shelter where I would feel like I was being imprisoned simply because of some financial shortfall. So, I just don't like it when we say that people, choose to be homeless. It's not that they choose to be homeless. They happen to have found themselves in a homeless situation, and they just choose not to be under the direct or indirect supervision of someone that says, well, you have to be up and out of here at 7. You can't come in, after 5. Dinner is at 6:30. And if you're not in line by 6:37, then you won't eat. I just, as a man, I'm not going to live under those rules, even if that means that I have to live outside, under a shade tree. Thank you.
So if a person chooses to not be in a shelter because the person doesn't want to follow any rules, isn't that the same as kind of choosing to be homeless when those are the two options?
I would disagree. And I speak from personal experience. When you're in a situation where you're in limbo, you don't ever believe that the day is going to end like it began, right? You always believe that that you're going to be able to do something today. I got just enough hustle for today to make it, right? But then it doesn't turn out that way. So then the day's gotten late, and so then we're into tomorrow. But again, tomorrow I got just enough hustle that I'm going to make it. And this is what happens. It's not that someone is necessarily doing it by choice. And I certainly understand, where you're coming from when you look at it from the outside. But as the young man that stood at the podium stated, unless you've found yourself in that situation, or unless you live amongst those who are in that situation, it's difficult for you to understand that thought process. And you can't allow yourself to believe that you're defeated, right? Because if you believe that you're defeated, then you'll be defeated. So you believe every morning that you get up, you know, I got this. You know, I'm gonna work this out today, right? You know, unfortunately, I've been trying to work this out, you know, for the last 376 days, and it hasn't worked out for me like I planned. But tomorrow, I still have to have that undefeated attitude, or I will be defeated. You know, I'm not saying that you may not, you know, run across an individual that just wants to be out there, but the largest majority of them, you know, they don't. That's not the way it works.
Representative Meyer.
I'm sorry, Representative Hoagland, directly related to this question. I did want to mention, too, that there are many areas of the state and the United States in general where individuals who are facing homelessness also face rampant discrimination in the shelter setting. That would include individuals who are part of the LGBTQ community. That would include individuals who have unrecognized disabilities, individuals who are part of non-traditional families, things of that nature, you know, and then individuals who don't necessarily practice the religion of the shelter that they have access to. And so, you know, I think that those all don't, you know, people don't necessarily want, in those situations particularly, don't necessarily want to be homeless. They just don't have another option when faced with those issues.
Representative Hoagland.
I also want to point out that not everybody that is homeless for a long period of time. There are people that run into a rough patch, they lose their place, they stay with somebody for a little while, they get back on their feet, they move into another place. So I don't want us to think that everybody we're talking about is going to be on, is going to need all these wraparound services for, you know, the rest of their life just to make it through the day. Because I think sometimes we get a little carried away with that. And then I think maybe during our off time we could all spend some time working in a homeless shelter, volunteer, even if it's just for a weekend. Talk to some people, hear their story. My wife got sick on Valentine's Day. She ended up dying and I lost my place. I mean, that's a real life story that happened to a guy that I met at the shelter, Doug. And there are just so many times that it's a medical issue, whether it was theirs or someone in their family. It could have been a conflict of opinions that gets somebody put out on the street. There are all sorts of stories. Everybody has a completely unique story, and their story of getting back into a house is also unique. There are people that work full-time in nursing that then come into a shelter every night to sleep. So that is, again, a societal thing where this lady's not making enough money working full-time as a nurse to afford a place to live. Some of them will move into turn a hotel room into an apartment because that way they don't have to pay utilities. They can make their monthly rent, they can do that. But having a cold snap, change your heating bill from $100 to $300 in a month is gonna put you back on the street. I mean, there are just people that live that close to the vest. That's it.
Representative Wagner.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. It has been a really interesting discussion here as far as, I mean, I will say one thing that struck me a little bit, you know, was that when they did the homeless count in Kansas, you know, it was a little over 2,500 people. You know, maybe that's going to inherently be somewhat of an undercount, but, you know, say it's 4,000 people or something. I don't know. But, you know, you're spending, I know we're already spending money just from the federal basis and whatever, but, you know, you get to, on 2,500 people, 25 million, that's like $10,000 per person, as far as on this. And as far as, I don't know, as far as just kind of keeping the size of the population, I do wish, I had actually had some people put a bug in my ear this last week in Hutchinson, and I'm just because there's people kind of setting up tents, in one of our downtown, park areas, which has just never happened before, And so it's caused some like, what the heck's going on? But the one person I was speaking with, when they talked to the people, which that was, I guess, part of their job, was that it wasn't people from Hutchinson. I mean, they were like coming from other states. Just like almost like a transient population, and just, I don't know. I know like some of the reps had said, you do have people who are just sort of temporarily homeless. They just couldn't pay their rent. They're sort of stuck in this weird situation, but they get kind of back on their feet. And as far as, how much of it is just a consistent population, I know one of the other reps was showing me just some data that, you have like people in domestic abuse situations who end up in a homeless shelter, or of course, the drug thing is clear. Or if it's not drugs, it can be, like mental health, just somebody who's just, they're not institutionalized anymore, and they've just, whatever, headed from California this way. So I don't, as far as sort of a policy direction on this, but I do know what's really gotten our attention on a national basis is just, you've had cities where they just, just let the homeless, we're going to accommodate them. We're just going to let them put up tents, all up and down the streets, and thinking that that's compassionate, when really at the end of the day, it just kills the livability of the city and creates all sorts of other problems. But the, I don't remember the moral of my story was going to be, except for just, that, and you do have this sort of policy debate going on as to, what is the best way. I think everybody acknowledges that just allowing people to set up these little tent cities is not kind of a kindness. It's kind of the wrong thing to do. It doesn't really help the homeless long term at all, and it just creates new problems. But as far as like what San Antonio did, which is kind of a big deal, it's a pretty big, complex versus just the housing, and I guess I've exceeded my 2 minutes, but but it's also a question of, are these people, is it just someone in just a temporary situation, or, how do these folks differ from folks who actually still have housing, but who are, below the poverty level? What does set the homeless population apart from the rest? Are they just the super poor, or they just have other issues? Anyway, thank you for your time.
Maybe we can come back to it. Hopefully we can. It's on my list of questions, but you can think about Representative Wagner, the concept of those the cities out, just pick on the West Coast, right? They thought they were being compassionate. Next thing you know, there's every median, every overpass is filled with tents. And then we've heard theories about rules about camping bans and vagrancy laws. There's ideas of putting that as a statewide statute. Would love to hear your thoughts on that later. But right now, Representative Droege.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question, I guess, along the same lines. I think it's not nearly as deep a thought as Representative Wagner, but like you mentioned, the West Coast or even Hutchinson. Why are they picking Hutchinson? Do they have laws and regulations that they aren't enforcing and are allowing these things to happen? It's always kind of which came first, the chicken or the egg. Back to the L.A., they kind of seemed like they allowed anything, and now they've got a tremendous problem that they can't get ahead of. I wonder, shouldn't the whole state, or municipalities, whole state, whatever you want to call it, should have some regulations so that it's enforced, so that it doesn't become easy to set up a tent and just live under the bridge. But I don't know how that, you know, you say, well, that doesn't counter to the people that are homeless, and that's not the reason that they got homeless. But it seems like if we make it easy for them to do the wrong thing, that we're not helping the situation.
Here we go. Representative Hoagland.
My statement was just going to be that I cannot imagine it's easy to live under a bridge in a tent. I think that would be one of the hardest lives ever. That's it.
Representative Carr.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. So, and this is just a brief, personal story. As many of you may have heard me talk at the well, at one point I was a bail bondsman. And so that I would stay up all night, I would, at 7 o'clock every day, a local pool hall would charge a table to me. And I would make it in at some point during the night, and I would play pool all night until I got a call from the county jail. And I would go down there and I'd come back. Here's what I didn't realize. The place would be full of kids. It was Greg Stevens' family game room. If you remember back in those days when Greg Stevens, table number 1, that was my table every night. The place is full of kids. I didn't recognize until just now how many of those kids were homeless, right? And I mean, just since I've been in this particular committee and we've been talking about homelessness, those kids every night, they'd come over and they'd say, hey, can I play on your table? Because I'd leave and go to the jail, but I'd keep the table charged to me so I could stay awake. And then as the place would close at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, they wouldn't have a place to go. They were always, like, hey, can I stay with you tonight? Or, I'm going to stay over here with so-and-so's got a house and we're going to stay over there. And they were in fact homeless. I didn't realize that they were homeless until we started having these conversations. But those kids, and full disclosure, very few of those kids look like me, right? This was Greg Stevens' family game room on Pawnee and Oliver, and most of those kids were Caucasian, and I would have never thought that they were in a homeless situation, but they were actually homeless because something had taken place in their house and they felt like they couldn't go home, or there was no home to go to. But those kids, and many times, that they would come and stay at my house for a night. Just don't get me wrong, I wouldn't let just anybody stay there, but I realize now that those were actually homeless kids. So like where that population comes from and where they go, I don't know, but I can say this, they didn't want to be homeless, right? Not at all, and they wanted jobs. They would always come to me, hey, Ford, have you got any work I can do? But it was always difficult for them because they didn't have cars, right? So they couldn't get to the job, even when I would connect them with someone that had a job, and some of them had skill. And to that point, I would say, if we would simply just attempt to work with those people that are in homeless situations and ask them, just do an assessment. What can you do, right? And then maybe we can put them in an area, in a field where they could get a job, and then they could possibly work themselves up out of the homeless situation or the temporary housing that we talked about. If it was, housing first. I must admit that, I never looked at the housing first as being permanent. I looked at housing first as this person's going to stay in this house until they can afford to get a place of their own where they would be able to take care of themselves. I just wanted to share that story and put that information out there, and thank you.
Roll out a question. So some cities currently, right, some cities seem to have more of a problem on the issue of homelessness, and some cities seem to not have as large of a problem. Any thoughts on that? Why would one city have fewer issues and other cities have more? Representative Hoagland.
If I may, I think some cities hide it better. I think most cities have people that are homeless, people that are couch surfing, and some cities just do a better job of not letting those people be seen.
Representative Droege.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am by no means an expert. I have one son that lives in Houston, and he was telling me about a homeless man downtown Houston. My son worked for J.P. Morgan. He said he kept trying to give this homeless man food or something else. The guy, he was Indian descent, and the guy said, I don't need anything. I just want to live down here. But, Houston is warm enough he could just go kind of wherever he wanted. But he didn't want a home, and he didn't want any goods or services. He was happy where he was. And my other son lives in Anchorage. In Anchorage, they call them urban survivalists. And there'll be people come from the outer parts of Alaska to Anchorage to spend the winter because they don't want to get snowed in, 500 miles from nowhere because there's no road system really in Anchorage or in Alaska. So there'll be some pretty good-sized tent cities. There are the homeless that we think of as I think we're talking about today, but then there are the other homeless that maybe work in the fishing industry during the summer or in the tourism industry, and they say, well, I'm not going to pay for a year's lease on an apartment when I can have a wall tent and propane heaters, and they have parties in these parks at night because Anchorage has got a lot of park systems. They're just a spread out kind of city with a lot of area, and the police patrol through that, and they show these. I watched a documentary on it, and because I was kind of fascinated, and they would have parties at night. But I mean, there were the homeless like we're talking about, but there were the other homeless that were just doing exactly what they wanted to do because they didn't want to spend the kind of money for an apartment in Anchorage. And they made enough money during the off season that they could live pretty well. Also, you probably read or heard that the mayor of Anchorage then started dealing with their homeless problem by buying them plane tickets. So where do you live or where do you want to go? Well, we'll buy you a plane ticket because we can buy you a plane ticket for $500-600, and that's a whole lot cheaper than dealing with it like we're talking about. So I think there's some upset people in Alaska over that. But anyway, that's just my 2 cents worth. I think it's like that gentleman said at the podium when we first started. It's a huge, complex problem, and I don't think any of us understand the whole thing. We might see what we see in our realm today, but I don't think that's the whole answer. And I don't think there's any easy fix, and it's going to be, we're talking years of, or like the representative said, it's never going to go away, and a lot of it. And so why did we get to this point? Is it because we did away with some of the mental institutions or some of the other basic things that we had years ago? Menninger's was in Topeka, was world renowned, and now we don't have those kind of places, and we put those people in a situation that they can't cope with, and we expect them to cope. So I don't know what my question is, but what do we do?
Representative Humphreys.
Like most of us, what do we do? I don't have an answer, but I want to make a few comments that, there are a few things we do know, even though it's very complex and we don't have all the answers, and probably most of us haven't lived it, even though we probably rub shoulders with volunteering at homeless shelters or different things. But one thing we know is that encampments are dangerous, and they're dangerous because of lots of things that go on, but sanitation, and we know children have died there, and we know that that's not the best life for most people because of the danger. And so what do we do? And I think evidence-based is a great thing to look at. I know of several places in Denver that my daughter volunteers at. She's spent many nights in a homeless shelter in New York City, by the way. And they have an amazing low recidivism rate, and they require a lot. It's not religious. I don't think they're making them go to services, but they have to work. That's kind of one of the main, they have to go to their counseling, they have to do their things, but they also have to work. And either at the place where they are, and the success rate is phenomenal. And so, I mean, that's one thing. And I appreciate Representative Carr's honesty that you might not want to go to a place that gives you lots of things to do like that. I mean, again, you haven't been in that situation. I haven't, so I can't say. But if people, I want to look at things that work, and maybe it is a higher bar for having to stay at places, because those are the places that do have the best evidence-based success rates. And if people choose not to do that, I do feel like it's their option to do. And when I hear that a city is hiding it, but people are couch surfing, I think that means they have a couch to stay on. I don't know. I don't know if that's better or worse, but it's not the sanitation danger with lots of kids, and that seems maybe better to me than the encampments, and that's an issue, and the safety. And anyway, so evidence-based, but I think what we see working is a collaboration between private, because this is private, it's a nonprofit, but they might get some public money, the one that my daughter works at. I want to do what works. And encampments are not working right now. So what do we do about that?
Before we get to Representative Carr, maybe hopefully we'll, do plan on getting back to that encampments, because that has been talked about, camping bans, tent bans, and also vagrancy laws. Would like to have that discussion a little bit later on, just what should those be, and should there be a statewide application of that? Representative Carr.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. Just as a clarification, I didn't mean that they didn't want to work, right? Because I frequently deal with the homeless, and I haven't ran across any who don't want to work. In fact, they always ask, if there's something that they can do, or do you have. So I just meant the other piece of that, where they've worked all day, and then they have to come back to a situation where someone's telling them they got to be there by a certain time. They can't. That's the piece that I was talking about. And then to Representative Haugland's point, with some places hiding it better than others. We actually hit it pretty good in Northeast Wichita, right? Because there's a whole lot of homeless that was going on in Northeast Wichita, but typically speaking, African-American people are a very loving people. If you don't believe me, next time you see someone having a picnic, just walk up and ask if you can have a plate, right? And they will open arms, tell you, come on in and have a plate. That's just what we do. So the homeless people that were in Northeast Wichita, they were always there. Now, of course, we've got the shelter, right? And now that the shelter is there, now we can see it. You couldn't see it before because it was just us, right? But now you can clearly see it, and people have complained about hey, we've got this shelter, but that's because now we've got more than our normal share of those people that were homeless that were simply hiding in a friend's, a cousin's, some family member, somebody that they run across, and they were couch surfing, if that's the term that you want to use. So we hide it right here, or at least in the state's largest city, in Wichita.
So earlier, Representative Hoagland, you mentioned the state being involved. You made a reference to education, and I don't want to say what you said because I didn't write it all down. But talking about state monies, but I believe you made somewhat of a statement, but some oversight with those funds. So as we talk about things like that, in your mind, what do you see as a proper and reasonable oversight from the state's perspective?
I've never done any grant writing, but from what I understand, when you write a grant, you tell them what you're going to use the money for, and then the money is provided, and then you prove that that's what you use the money for. So I figure I think if localities could come up with a plan, make a request around these parameters, be funded, they fund around those parameters, they provide the services they said they were going to provide, that's the kind of oversight. That we give you money for X and you do X with it.
So on that thought, should outcomes, if the topic is homelessness and we're looking at point in time counts, numbers, should outcomes be part of that to where we see a reduction in numbers?
I don't know that you'll see a reduction in numbers. I think there are several different types of outcomes that can happen. People are healthier, people are happier, people are working, people's lives have improved. I think those are the outcomes that we need to look for. As people's lives improve, they will become homed. As you're able to stand on your own 2 feet, then you're going to get a house. I mean, it's not, in my mind, it's not a forever solution. Now, there are people that have disabilities, whether they be physical or mental, they're going to have continued support. But that's part of our Medicaid system anyway.
So one quick follow-up there. It would seem to be like an endless growth, potentially. If we're not looking at outcomes as far as decreasing the numbers, what would prevent it from continuing to grow to the point of the numbers and the cost becoming unsustainable, and then the state being left with a large number that cannot be helped?
I would love to think that I can solve this problem, but I can't. Heather's got some input there. She does social work. I don't. I sell houses. So if you know anyone homeless that needs a house, I would be happy to help them.
Nice punt. Representative Howell.
Just really quickly, I think maybe, I think there's a couple little factors that we need to consider as we think about outcomes. One of them might be perhaps recidivism might be a better word choice to consider. Are we actually helping the people that are entering the system get to stability and as many as possible to actual not only be stable but be independent? Okay. But at the same time, and I think we can overall lower numbers, but we also have to recognize, I don't know if this is the best word choice, but this is one I have now. There's always going to be somewhat of a trickle of people entering, becoming homeless and let me give examples of that, okay? There are always going to be, I mean, the scripture says we are always going to have the poor, okay? There are always going to be people who live paycheck to paycheck, and let's say their house burns down tonight, and let's say they don't have a church family, they don't have friends, because we have lots of people like that post-COVID. They have nobody to go couch surf on. That's the sad reality for some of these people. And so they need temporary help of a place to stay, just what they still have their job in that case, okay? They need a temporary place to stay and maybe temporary help, perhaps with just finding a new place to rent, let's say if there was a nonprofit that wanted to pay their down payment, not down payment, but you know what I'm talking about. I'm sorry, what? Deposit, thank you. Their deposit and get their first utilities situated, and then they're back on they're functioning again. And hopefully maybe giving them some money management classes or something, okay? There's those kind of scenarios. There's also scenarios, which is one that happens frequently in our area, is because all the workforce parolees and stuff from the entire state come to Wichita. We constantly have people that are getting out on parole who at best are going to have a very low income job. So, for example, at McDonald's for $14 an hour, and they're going to work 30 hours or less because McDonald's doesn't hire full-time employees for the most part, and because they don't want to pay benefits, and they need some place to stay, and you can't. I mean, you take $14 an hour times 30 times 4 and find a place to pay rent and utilities, you can't afford to do that. So there's going to be a constant trickle of people in that situation, for example, that are going to be needing assistance into getting trained for better jobs, helping find someone who's willing to take someone who has a criminal record, et cetera, et cetera. So there always is going to be some trickle in of situations of people becoming homeless that are maybe be very legitimate. But so I think the recidivism is something, factor to consider, and just have a balanced viewpoint. And that was way too long. I apologize.
Representative Meyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Representative Howell, because that was kind of where I was going to bounce to. You know, outcomes are very difficult to track in situations like this for that reason. We can track certain outcomes, and I'm not a research expert in this field at all, but I do understand how we do the tracking. And as Representative Howell was saying, we might want to look more at the recidivism rate versus the outcomes as like just a straight, you know, solid line. Because if we look at that, it may appear as though the problem's never getting better, when in actuality it could be, because we are housing and people and helping them find, you know, solutions to some of their issues as they work through the process. But that's, I think, it's difficult when doing funding allocation and grant writing for these reasons, for these specific reasons, because the differences in outcomes for social service programs of this nature are going to look different if you just do it straight outcomes like that versus a recidivism rate. So we may think about doing something similar to how recidivism is tracked in other areas of our systems. That would be one idea. But then I also wanted to mention, you know, to reduce that rate of recidivism and to reduce the overall rate of poverty and homelessness, I think it's important that we address affordable housing and really strengthen our safety net services. And I know that we've had many debates on those safety net services here, and our thoughts vary greatly. And I would like to go on the record saying I don't just want to give people everything all the time, although I know sometimes it may appear that way. But, you know, truly, I think what we can see from across the United States, and even if we look at other countries too, is that when we have strong safety nets for people, so prevention methods, you know, healthy, a good healthcare infrastructure, access to healthcare, access to good paying jobs, you know, access to food, safe housing, things like that. You know, that's when these issues start to truly reduce. And so I think if we're going to talk about recidivism and talk about outcomes and tie funding to that, then we really need to look at making sure that our safety net programs are adequately funded, expanded in some cases, and really provide people with the tools that they need in order to make their lives better and to get out of the situations that they're in.
Definitely a lot of different approaches. Representative Pickert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this has been real interesting, just sitting here and listening to all these ideas. And, you know, we only have a few weeks before this bill needs to be moved on. And so the recidivism idea is awesome, but it takes time to establish recidivism. I mean, you know, you have to track people over a period of time. I can see if there are some cities or small towns that have a great program for homelessness, it's going to attract people. I mean, people move. And so I think, you know, we need to think about some of these parameters, and one of them would be, you know, who will be served? Is it people that only live in, like, since I'm from Wichita, from within the Wichita city limits, or Sedgwick County, or, you know, a 4-county area? You know, I think there has to be some kind of parameters there that will help people not keep moving, you know, if everybody is on the same page that way. So anyway, just a thought. And also for working, I asked Representative Humphreys what she meant by in Denver, the people that are in the homeless shelter are working. They're actually doing things in the shelter, you know, to help with, that cuts down on your overhead, really, you know, and it gives people a little sense of purpose, too. So I think that's an element that needs to be considered. Thank you.
So going back to an idea that was discussed a little bit earlier, just the rules on camping. I just had a friend go back up to the Northwest. Where he spent many years up in the Seattle area. So he was very familiar with Washington and Oregon. And that was probably back in the 90s. And he just recently went back there for a presentation that he gave, and he landed and he says it's a whole new world up there. Every highway, every overpass, pretty much packed solid with tents. I think that's a situation we don't really want to allow here in Kansas. We don't want to see that. But in order to not allow that, there might need to be some sort of a ban, a rule against it. And if that were to be in place, what would it look like? And any thoughts on a statewide? Representative Wagner, if you want to comment, I know you kind of brought it up a little bit ago. Do you have any thoughts on that? Put you on the spot.
Well, sorry, I'm partly doing two things at the same time, so I'm a little distracted. But I will say, as a matter of fact, the person who was talking who was, you know, in the whatever law enforcement, you know, that they did comment. I asked him, well, don't they have vagrancy laws in Hutch? I mean, you know, and the person, you know, explained that it actually is kind of complicated, just as far as on a local level, and again, this is unsolicited commentary, but he did wonder what, like, if something on some sort of state level, you know, would actually be helpful with them having a protocol, you know, to deal with this. Just simply because there's a popular park in the downtown area that folks are whatever, parents with children are becoming really reluctant to go to because they're just kind of being forced out by sort of a group of folks who have just sort of encamped, you know, in the area. And just, again, you know, they were very realizing it's a little bit of a sticky wicket, but I don't know. I mean, they felt that the sort of local options, you know, were not, you know, as good as they would have hoped. So, anyway.
Representative Carr.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. Briefly, my question to you was going to be, what do we do? Just lock them up? Because that's what it sounds like. You know, we keep talking about, and so how do we lock them up? But then as Representative Wagner spoke, I also remember the statement that was made during that testimony was that you don't have anywhere to put them, right? So then it's a circle. Like we can't, for what it costs, you know, us to house someone in a city or county jail, you know, we could have just thrown money at it, like we're talking about not doing. You know, it's very expensive to keep someone in protective custody. So I think as we talk about this moving forward, just the idea that we're going to lock them up, I don't think that's an idea that we should be considering without some other alternative or option, because you know financially that doesn't work. The amount of paperwork and police presence and power that would take, just locking them up isn't, never has been, doesn't solve it, because when they get out, guess where they go? Right back where they came from. Then we lock them up again. It's just a cycle in a circle. So, you know, I understand that there should be some regulation, but we should be looking at what to do as opposed to just stopping at the point where, you know, we'll make it a state law and lock them up. Thank you.
Representative Humphries?
I've never heard anyone say enforcing encampment ordinances results in locking people up. I've never heard that mentioned in this committee, that the result of taking care of encampments is to lock people up. Never once.
Representative Carr?
And I'm not saying that anyone's ever said that, but when you start talking about making it a law and enforcing a law, what typically happens when you break a law, you're either fined or you're locked up. And if I'm incorrect, then correct me, because the next time I break a law, I'll probably take that option as opposed to the fine or being locked up.
I don't know what the ordinances say. I mean, that would be a great thing to know. I know Amanda Stanley stood here and talked about Topeka. That sounds like they're really doing some good things. And I don't know, I mean, I think she called it cleaned up an encampment, or I think that's the terminology she used. They were not taking people to the county jail. I don't know what they were doing. We should find out. That's a great question.
Well, that
But
was the point I was making.
that's what it was. I never thought that that's what was happening.
And again, that may just be, you know, a difference in perception that we've had earlier. But when I hear that, I don't know what other people hear, but that's certainly what I hear. And the point that I was making is that I have no problem with those enforcing those rules. But as we enforce them, let's talk about what we're going to do with those people as opposed to just locking them up.
Representative Miller?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. During our probably all of us, when we got elected, we all said that we wanted the problem solved at the lowest level, which means that the communities or counties should do it. The state shouldn't get involved in a statewide law on it. And I know Johnson County is very concerned about statewide laws getting into their business. We've also saw different programs and said this program works here, this program works there. And, you know, one size does not fit all. In one community, one solution to the problem may be one way, and in another community, another way. But you're closest to the problem at the lowest level, and there's alternatives you could take that perhaps you could solve those problems. And another thing that I'd like to bring out is I agree with Representative Droege about you can't just shovel money at a problem and you're going to fix it. But I could talk to Representative Meyer and say, if you wanted to help more individuals come back into society as useful members, what do you need? And she might say, I need 3 more psychiatrists. I need a social worker that can help on drug abuse problems, but I need the money for it. So you have to kind of invest in a problem to solve it so you don't have to keep pouring money into it for those wraparound services. So, and well, that's basically all I said. I would prefer not to see a statewide level about encampments. I would rather see the communities handle it if they can't handle it, maybe down the road, we could revisit it. Thank you.
I would agree with you. I'd like to see the local communities handle it as well. It's when they start to come and ask for other people's money, but maybe some of their practices on a local level may not be the best as far as keeping an issue from growing and getting out of control. And so the reason for a statewide would be if they want state money, but they're also kind of almost causing their own problems. It seems like we're just pouring water into sand, expecting it to have a good result. So that would be the quick concept of Representative Miller.
Well, I've been in contact with Johnson County, and they're actually rather in favor of the bill presented a few days ago, but they're very upset about the way that it was worded, that we have to abide by some policies, like with encampments and homeless people, because they're afraid that they're going to have to arrest people, and that costs way more money than it's, that they think it's worth, and it's also nothing. But they have their own plans in Johnson County to help with the homeless, and they're in process of doing that right now. But they said that they wouldn't mind seeing this train leave the station where they got some money too. So, it's one side doesn't quite agree with the other side.
If you find anybody that comes to Topeka and doesn't have their hand out, you let me know.
We're in taxation, we know that, don't we?
Every day, every day. Representative Meyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will make this short because I see that we're at 3 o'clock. I think that we all have varying views on this, but I would like everyone to try to go back and find the testimony that we saw last year, last session, on the specific bill that would essentially criminalize vagrancy and encampments, and look at that testimony, the proponents and, well, the singular proponent and the multiple over 50 opponents, and really look at what they're saying, because they're the ones working on the ground, and we heard from municipalities too. And so I think that would be very valuable for us to revisit as we look at this part of the bill. But I also did want to mention, I don't think that any of us wants to go so wild as to just say, we want to be like the Pacific Northwest where they just have tents everywhere. I've got friends who still live up there, and it's awful. I think well-meaning people try to do some things, but then it just turned out bad. And we, as Representative Humphreys said, it's very dangerous. So we do have to address it at some level, but I think that we should look to the experts.
Thank you, committee. Hopefully that was worth everybody's time. Certainly was enjoyable. I think it was good to get everybody the opportunity to talk it through. One thing for research, quickly, Ida, were you copied on the request from the city of Wichita, the answers to the questions? Would you be willing to send that to the committee and just make it a public document, that reply? The city of Wichita did request that the rest of the committee saw the answers to those questions. If you could just send that document, that would be great. All right. And that's, we just asked the city of Wichita, just for reference, some of the questions regarding some of their ordinances and what they believe they could enforce, couldn't enforce. So that should be coming here shortly. With that, we'll meet again next Tuesday.